Hey guys, Jason here with a DM discussion video. Today's discussion will center around one of the most hated cards in the Duel Masters TCG, Corile. For its manageable cost and its ability to effectively buy the user a turn, many consider Corile to be a card that is unfun at best and unfair at worst. But what if I told you that the card is not as broken as you might think? I say this because in recent times, the card has seen little to no success in the IDC tournaments run by the German Duel Masters channel, which I consider to be the best reference for successful strategies in the TCG today. So what gives? Well, in this video, I'll be covering 3 reasons why I believe Corile has lost its luster. Reason 1. Come into play effects. Duel Masters is a game built around instant gratification. It's widely accepted that creatures whose effects activate upon entering are seen as more effective than creatures whose don't. This is because the opponent doesn't get a chance to deny the effect, so you immediately make your money back when you play the creature. As a result, cards like Bronze Arm Tribe and Aquahulcus are considered staples, while their slower counterparts with larger upsides like Silver Axe and Hypersquid Walter don't see play at all. Because of this deck-building mentality, Corile often finds itself in situations where it doesn't have great targets because bouncing a creature will allow the opponent to reuse the advantage-generating effect. Intuitively, I think Corile gained a lot of notoriety among players because it oftentimes exposed cards that weren't super great to begin with. By and large, Corile earned a reputation for being a counter to evolutions, big attackers, and various other creatures without come-into-play effects, many of which are not particularly competitive. This isn't to say that Corile can't counter any highly competitive cards, but what I am suggesting is that given the circumstances, Corile's utility is not particularly impressive. Because of the heavy emphasis on advantage-generating come-into-play effects, and the fact that Corile's effect is compulsory, the idea that Corile doesn't have many good targets in a competitive DM setting is actually not very surprising. So while we're on the subject of Corile's not-so-spectacular utility, this brings me to my next talking point, which is... Reason 2. The advent of the Untargetables. Because spot removal exists in every deck of every playstyle in some way, shape, or form, having immunity to it is a very handy ability. It is therefore unsurprising that Petrova Chandler of Suns, Juliana Chandler of Suns, and Warlord Elzonius have established themselves as strong players in the IDC metagame by making appearances in top-placing decks. Petrova is of course a cornerstone of most tribal decks and is most commonly paired with Guardians, Initiate, Beast Folk, and Liquid People. Juliana is a card that can justify its spot in many control decks as a countermeasure to aggro. And Warlord Elzonius, for being a difficult-to-remove finisher, has its own dedicated archetype. As Corile's ability to impact the game is further scrutinized, it certainly doesn't help that a handful of important players have complete immunity to what makes Corile strong in the first place. It is an especially painful realization as well when you consider that these are the types of creatures Corile would otherwise eat for breakfast. A mini-boss with no advantage-generating effect on entering, a blocker with no come-into-play effect, and an evolution. There's no doubt in my mind that it is a combination of factors that makes these cards good rather than just their immunity to Corile, but I can't help but feel that their success and relative popularity are somewhat contributory to Corile's fall from grace. But one might reasonably argue that given everything we've talked about so far, Corile is still situationally broken. Sure, there are a handful of situations where it's not that strong, but against certain cards, 1 or 2 Corile might buy you the turns you need to win the game. Well, that brings me to my third and final talking point, which is... Reason 3. The TCG trending away from mid-range decks. While the mid-range playstyle is the one I enjoy the most, I do believe it is the least powerful at the top level. By their very nature, mid-range decks live up to the phrase, Jack of all, master of none, much to their own detriment. Corile is, in my opinion, a great example of a good mid-range card, as its cost allows it to come out at the midpoint of the game, and it has the capability to cause huge momentum swings. Theoretically, it can control aggro decks by removing a threat and bricking them for a turn, and it can aggro control decks by removing a blocker and pressuring the board. However, with the optimizations being made in deck building, the most effective strategies seem to lean towards the extreme ends of the spectrum: hardcore aggro or hardcore control. This is seen in the German Duel Masters tier lists, tiers 1 to 1.5, which I believe are accurate. I feel that Corile is in a very uncomfortable position where it's too slow to properly combat the strongest decks. By the time Corile hits the field against Fire Nature Rush or Rug Aggro, the user is probably just 1 or 2 pyros away from defeat. Similarly, Corile is not great at pressuring the likes of Foremost Control or Fortress Swap because of how little it does to affect the overall game state. Given all of this, I still think it would be unfair to say that Corile can never be useful in any top-tier matchup, or even that mid-range decks are completely unviable. But when contending with what are currently the game's strongest decks, the versatility and impact Corile and the mid-range playstyle are meant to bring leave much to be desired. In conclusion, while I still consider Corile to be a good card, I don't think it's the broken monster people might have once considered it to be. With all of the developments in the IDC landscape, Corile has more often than not found itself on the chopping block during the deck building process. However, I also believe that the Duel Masters TCG can be a very diverse game in terms of the creative vision of its communities and how its rule set is regulated. In this regard, IDC matchups and results only form part of the picture when assessing Corile's overall legacy. In our own format, where we try to maximize the number of decks that can compete with each other, Corile continues to be a threat. The 40 card limit nerfing control, and the absence of the likes of Fire Nature Rush have allowed it to thrive. In the OCG, especially during the first 12 to 13 sets, Corile did see play on and off, but often found itself having to compete with Aqua Surfer in some of the top-tier mid-range decks. Interestingly, Corile was also never considered Hall of Fame worthy, though the OCG was admittedly a lot faster than the TCG due to the abundance of aggressive draw and prevalence of Bombazar. At the end of the day, I understand that, for better or for worse, Corile will always be a card that elicits strong emotions from the general public. But in the wake of some recent developments, I am beginning to believe that Corile is a card not entirely deserving of its heinous reputation. After all, it's hard to argue a card is broken when it sees little to no success at the top level. Or hey, maybe the next big deck that takes Corile to the top has yet to be discovered. And that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you found this discussion somewhat enlightening, or at least entertaining. But as usual, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.